In this video, we're going to start taking a look at specific types of different ways to write our conditional statements. One of those is called the converse. And basically, the converse flips the antecedent with the conclusion. And it says if P implies Q, then the converse is going to be that Q implies P. The inverse states that if P implies Q, then you keep the antecedent as well as the conclusion in the same order, except you just negate those. And then finally, the contrapositive, of those flips the antecedent and the conclusion, but then it also negates those. Of those three, the only one that's logically equivalent to the initial statement is going to be the contrapositive. All right, so, and I'm going to show you in a moment that that's true. Right? So only the contrapositive is logically equivalent to the original conditional statement. And how can we verify this? Well, we can always verify it with a truth table. So let's do that. So we have P and Q, and because we only have two statements, we have true, true, false, false, and we have true, false, true, false. And remember, P implies Q. All right, so remember, P implies Q is only false when true implies false. Remember the example, if you study, then you will pass. And the only time that I lie to you is if you do study and you don't pass. So this is true, false, true, true. Now, what about the contrapositive? Well, contrapositive says not Q implies not P, all right? And not P is going to be false, false, true, true. So just negating this column right here. And not Q is going to be false, true, false, true. And again, the only time that we end up with a false statement is going to be when not Q is going to be true and not P is going to be false. So if we have true implies false, that output is going to be false. And the only time that happens, not Q is true, implies false is right here. All right. All the other times we have false implies false, so that's true. We have false implies true, so that's true, and true implies true, so that's true. And check this out. This column and this column are logically equivalent to one another. So we verified that the contrapositive is indeed logically equivalent to the original conditional statement. If you want to verify that the converse and the inverse are not logically equivalent, just do the exact same thing. Just make a truth table and you can verify that for yourself. So let's write a few statements and let's see how the inverse, converse, contrapositive work with a basic sort of one of these conditional statements. So we can clearly see that if I study, so I study as P, I will pass as Q. All right. So if we think of this in terms of the inverse, we're just going to flip those statements. So the inverse of this statement, or I'm sorry, the converse is when we would flip those. We're going to say that if I pass, then I will study, or I study. And again, that's not logically equivalent. The inverse is just going to negate both P and Q. So that means that if I do not study, then I will not pass. And then finally, the contrapositive is going to be, we're going to flip those, and then we're going to go ahead and negate. So that's going to be if I do not pass, or if I will not pass, then I will not study. And again, the contrapositive is the only one that's logically equivalent. All right, so just make sure later in the course when we start needing the contrapositive to be able to do some proofs that you remember that that's the one that's going to be logically equivalent to the original statement. All right, now this one's a little bit trickier because we have three statements. So if I am tall, then I drink milk, or I am good at basketball. So our three statements, one of them is I am tall. So let's think of that as P. And I drink milk, or I am good at basketball. So let's call this Q. And let's call I am good at basketball R. So this would be P implies Q or R. All right. So that means that the converse would be Q or R implies P. Right? And so if I wanted to write that, because our directions say to write it in a sentence, well, as a sentence, that would state, and it still has to be an if then. So if I drink milk, or if I'm good at basketball, or we could just say, or I am good at basketball, then I am tall. All right. And again, that's our converse. All right. Now, unfortunately, the inverse and the contrapositive, a lot of times students will make a mistake here. All right. So, and I'm going to make the mistake first, and then I'm going to explain what the mistake is. So remember, the inverse, you just negate. Okay. So generally, a lot of students would write it like this. So if I am not tall, then I am not good, or I do not drink milk, then I do not drink milk, or I am not good at basketball. All right. And that's almost correct, right? But there's only one word in here that makes it not correct. All right. And the word is going to be or. All right. So unfortunately, or has to be replaced with and. All right. And why do we have to do that? Well, you might recall De Morgan's law. Right? So let's take a trip back to our logical equivalencies. And De Morgan's law states that not P or Q is equivalent to not P and not Q. Okay, so remember, you have to flip the quantifier. And so the or becomes an and that's exactly what happens here. So if we have the inverse would be not P implies not Q or R. And this statement is logically equivalent to not Q and not R, right? And that would be not Q and not R. All right, so be really careful with that. Just make sure that if for some reason you're asked to be able to do the contrapositive or the inverse, that you make sure that you change any ors and ands respectively. Right? The contrapositive is going to have the exact same issue. So the contrapositive of this would be, so we're going to negate this. So if I do not drink milk, and I am not good at basketball, then I am not tall. All right. And again, we had to flip that. The contrapositive for this one logically would be not Q or R implies not P. All right. So remember, you have to flip the antecedent and the conclusion. And that's how we're going to get to our contrapositive. All right. So hopefully that helps you to understand how we're going to write these inverses, converses, and contrapositives. All right. This is the main part to be interested in. And we're going to take that a step further in the next video. And we're going to start looking at argument and argument forms. All right. But for right now, let's just make sure that we understand this and we understand the trick with the De Morgan's law when necessary.